I have really enjoyed Wichita. Been here for 2 days. I've met so many great people. I feel like I was just saying, I feel like I've already talked with so many people about so many interesting things that this might be a bit of a repeat for some people tonight. But I'm going to try to talk about themes that are running through the pieces that are in the exhibition that might not be immediately apparent, since I know that there's a diversity from the projects, to say the least. So I'm going to be talking about how some of those pieces may or may not tie together, and hopefully they'll tie together more by the time I'm finished talking. And I thought I'd start back from when I left graduate school, go up to the work that's in the show now, and if we have time at the end, I'll show some of the new work that just opened up at the show in London that I'm doing. So one thing that's going to connect some of the work in the exhibition is this idea of a middle point between what's happening in artistic practice and what's happening in hacker communities. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But maybe more so than that, I've been thinking about this relationship between misuse and empowerment, and how, whether we're talking about technologies or we're talking about culture, there's elements that we can misuse to our own benefit to have a kind of louder voice in society than perhaps we were meant to have. And so the work that I'm doing, it shows up in galleries like we have here. It shows up in public space. I have another strain of my work that shows up outside, sometimes as art pieces, sometimes as tools for other artists. And then I have another side of my work that happens natively within the web browser. The internet plays a big part of my work, whether that's acting as an influence or it's acting as a primary medium. And so I have some pieces that happen within the browser. And so even those seem like very different mediums, different venues for the work, and as I'll talk about more, different audiences, I hope that there's some kind of connection, and I'm going to use this thread of misuse that goes between the pieces. So I'll start back in New York at Parsons. This is after I sort of quit my job in architecture and decided to try out an MFA degree. Moved to New York. And so I was in a situation where I was new to New York, given up the car, kind of become a pedestrian. I was living in Brooklyn and commuting to Lower Manhattan. And in that commute, I was passing by graffiti every day. And as I was kind of falling in love with that work, then I was sitting in classes and I was learning how to program for the first time. I was learning more about the open source culture in classes, learning about interactivity. And those two kind of like interests started blending together into what would become my thesis when I was at school. And so the first part of my thesis was a project was the earlier version of Graffiti Taxonomy, which show up as 3 prints within the gallery. And those pieces started by just me taking hundreds and hundreds of graffiti photos as I walked around the city. And I was falling in love with the tags, like the kind of part of graffiti that I think for a lot of people is the hardest to love. But for me, it felt more visceral, it felt more real, and this was kind of a culture that I didn't have any background in, and I was starting to get interested in who these people were, what they were writing, why they were writing it. But again, like at the same time that I was looking at this and thinking about this, I was also reading a lot of Edward Tufte, getting into data visualization, and so I was trying to think of like, what would Edward Tufte have done if he were sort of falling in love with graffiti? And so what I ended up making from that idea was I basically just stole Edward's idea of small multiples, right? This idea that if you have this kind of large and complex data set, if you reduce that all to the same visual language, the same scale, what ends up popping up are the differences in the form rather than the differences in how they're depicted. And so from these graffiti photos, I would kind of clean their background, remove them from their surroundings, which is kind of a cardinal sin within the graffiti community. So I'd turn them all to black and white, remove the surroundings, and then I would highlight one letter. I always do these studies about, okay, what letter showed up in this 20 blocks more so than any others? And I would do these studies where we would see different voices depicted as one letter. So this is the letter A, I think from Harlem. This is the letter E from the Lower East Side. This is the letter O from Paris. And what I liked about this and why I think this maybe has implications outside of graffiti is because I was also starting to hang out with graffiti writers more. And like, this is what they see when they walk down the street all the time. Like, I think for people that are outside of that community, which I was a part of at one point, graffiti can become kind of like advertising in the sense that you kind of train your brain not to look at it. It's like this information stream that we sort of intentionally don't look at, you know? But graffiti writers see this whole other world, and they see that in something as simple as a circle, or as something as a gesture as simple as the letter S, there's actually this whole other world. There's this, like, I like to view this project as graffiti vision. Like, this is what they see when they walk down the street. And it's this other, like, really vibrant world of letters that's happening all around us. And I started to fall in love with it too. So I started to have this kind of graffiti vision. And so this was me trying to give other outsiders to that world a sort of glimpse into it. And I think that that's another thing that I think might connect some of the pieces in the gallery, is this idea of sort of visualizing the unseen to some degree, or trying to break us out of these common things that we pass by every day and show us a new way of looking at our immediate surroundings. So this was the beginning of that research thread. Ended up taking a turn at one point in the last year of the program and turning away from looking at the formal aspects of graffiti to thinking more about graffiti as a dance, like, and just forgetting about the ink and the spray paint and just thinking about this motion that they write. Because the other thing I started seeing when I would go out with graffiti writers and watch them writing is like how beautiful it was just to see their hand move. Like, no matter how ugly that ink looked on the door the next morning, like that dance of them writing it was really beautiful, because the architect in me kind of had still this romantic notion of a form versus function relationship. And I think graffiti has that in this really beautiful way, where these letters, they don't necessarily look like that because that's how someone wanted them to look in a perfect world. That's how they needed to be written in this very quick way. Like, a lot of graffiti writers have a lot of emphasis on one-liners, right? Like, if you can write a tag in a singular line, this is a benefit because, for one, it's quicker, and for two, it kind of informs. It's maximized with speed because you're not wasting any ink in those few seconds that the pen's off the wall, right? Because there's this economy that has to happen because you're writing under these conditions that are very, very interesting design constraints. So this second phase of my research was called Graffiti Analysis, and it was trying to deal with what that motion was. And so again, I was reading a lot of Edward Tufte. I was trying to see how people had dealt with depicting movement behind writing in print. Specifically, I started looking at a lot of calligraphy, both kind of Eastern and Western calligraphy, and how that has been kind of archived. And then I started writing software, because I was also, of course, learning how to write code, getting involved with like open source software and learning about what that community was all about. And so I started making this software where there was really two parts. There was a capture software where I would meet with graffiti writers in my apartment, and they would bring their own pen, I would strap a light source to it, and they would just write like normal, and I would tell them just forget about the interface and just write like you would normally write. And so what you're seeing on the right is the sort of playback, the secondary playback of that data. And it's meant to, again, be thinking more from a data visualization standpoint than just an artistic or aesthetic standpoint. So the decisions that are made in that software were meant not as an expression, but more as just how do I represent movement as much as possible in code. And so the thickness of that white line doesn't have to do with the ink, it has to do with the speed. So the thinner that line gets, the faster the pen was moving. The particles you see are getting thrown off based on velocity, so you'll see an even spread when there's a kind of rounded corner. If there's a jagged, you'll see a spike. So the particles are also meant to just be a visual accentuation of that motion. And then time is kind of happening in the third dimension. So it's as if the ink was kind of being pulled out of the pen as it moves along. And so you can rotate around that three-dimensionally and sort of see how the ink is layering up. And so then I was thinking, okay, I'm trying to be more like a researcher. I'm trying to be more like this like data viz embedded nerd within the graffiti community. And how should I then display that data? And the thing that I kind of latched onto is this idea that if it was the movement that was making me fall in love with this aspect of graffiti that was so hard for people to love, right? Like I've heard so many times like, oh, I love graffiti, but I hate the tags, right? And so for me, it was kind of the opposite. Like how do I gain people access into that sort of art form that was inspiring me in the same way that I had tried to do with the Graffiti Taxonomy before. And so the idea I kind of struck upon was I would present the motion back out in the city, right? Because the motion was this thing that I got to watch, but nobody else got to watch. And so I was doing these projections where the playback application was showing that movement kind of on loops, and I was doing this in New York, and I was doing that as I would travel around with my art practice. And then at one point, like I met a graffiti writer who, a Viennese graffiti writer who was like, you know, this is awesome, I'm all in, let's work together. He's like, but I write really differently in the studio than I write when I'm outside. And he was totally right. He basically called me out for having bad data because all those form-function relationships that I was so interested in graffiti for the first time were all gone when you come into my studio because there's no police, there's no ledges, there's no people walking down the street, right? All those aspects that make graffiti so interesting weren't in my studio. So he's like, we've got to figure out how to take this outside. So then I started trying to capture the data outside, right? And then this, all of a sudden, of course, became much more fun for me. And so this is some documentation from that first time that he and I went out that night and tried to sort of figure out how to do this out in the city. And this is a less than ideal scenario. It's basically me holding my laptop and being like a human tripod and running the software and trying to capture this writing out in the street when it's happening. And then that data that I have now is not just tied to the writer, but it's also tied to this physical location. Like all the things that went into that tag and that wall made that data what it was. There's obvious design flaws in this early prototype. For example, if you have an illegal graffiti art practice, the last thing you want is a giant light attached to the tip of your marker, right? So like infrared is clearly the way to go after this. So this is an example on a glass bus shelter where you can sort of see him writing. As it's happening in real time. And then so on the other end, I was also trying to figure out other ways of getting that off the screen. And so this is a sort of third piece of software in this suite where it would convert that data into a 3D model under the same kind of ideas as the software was doing before, where the thickness is about speed. So the thicker points on the model are where the pen was slowing down. Time is again stretched in the Z dimension, and then when it casts a shadow, you can sort of see the two-dimensional form of the tag. You can see another example here. And so then this was a way, again, about trying to take that, like, 7 seconds it takes to make that tag, right? That 7 seconds that these people have drawn, like, thousands and thousands and thousands of times, right? It's a very confident motion you're seeing when you're watching graffiti writers write. And then trying to figure out how to freeze that tag. And then I think some of the work that I was doing with graffiti writing and some of the work I'll talk about later that I've been doing in relationship to the internet, like, I'm interested in a lot of how ephemeral some of these things are and how to play with that time scale and thinking about how they work then on a longer time scale, right? So this is the sculpture that's in the gallery now from this graffiti writer named Katsu in New York, who is a collaborator and a friend and someone whose work I really enjoy. And so this is in a way like a kind of gift to him in a sense, where like this is a tag that's now in bronze, right? So this will be the last Katsu tag on Earth. Like after the sun has like buffed all the paint, and when this will be the last one, you know, when the kind of apocalypse is here and it's kind of creeping out of some landfill. And it's also, so it's, again, it's really about archiving motion and thinking about graffiti just as this act of motion, at least for a moment, at least in this project. And I think between that idea of thinking about it not as vandalism for a moment, and also about recontextualizing it in this other form. Like the other thing I noticed is that I could bring this now into exhibition spaces that may even have, you know, these people's tags like on the outside of the building. These may be tags that they'd like buffed off the morning before, but they come in and people look at it in this totally new way, you know? And in a sense, I don't think you can remove the illegal act from graffiti at all, like it turns into something else, but for a moment, like just with this one project, it's sort of interesting to see how people react when they're just then looking at that movement and thinking about it in, like, again, like trying to look at their surroundings in this new way without having all this baggage that's coming to it. So that was like where my thesis project led to. Like all this didn't happen when I was in school, but this was kind of started when I was in graduate school. But the other thing that happened to me when I was in graduate school and working on the software for the first time was I was really influenced by the internet, and this kind of like long, drawn out 2-year thesis project didn't feel very internet to me, you know? It didn't feel very like grasping at the moment of what was happening immediately. And so at the same time that I was doing this longer project, I was also doing these weekend projects, right? And I still enjoy this, but at the time I was really into the idea of projects where you would kind of have an idea in the shower in the morning, and then like by that evening it'd be on the internet, you know? This project life cycle that happens really, really quick. And I don't think that all art should have to be that way, but for me it was like, it became a kind of empowering thing to think that like this can happen on the weekend. We don't have to sit here and pontificate on all the projects all the time. Like these can be ideas that we just get out into the world. And so I was experimenting with that also. I'm going to show an earlier project from that, not because I think it's the best work I've ever done, but because it's a project that I think back to a lot when I find myself spending potentially too much time on projects. So this one is called Postal Labels Against Bush. This was done in 2004. It was a different time. And it starts with you know, these free postal labels that you can get from the post office. This would be, hackers are oftentimes trying to exploit a weakness in a system, right? And so the weakness in the postal system in this case is that they have this two-way information stream that's unguarded, right? Where you can take these postal labels and you can also put them back. And so I took a series of postal labels and I would run them through my home crappy printer here. And I did some kind of really basic color and font matching, and I just added this one sentence that says, the USPS does not acknowledge the authority of the Bush administration. And then, as you might guess, the rest of the video is like hidden camera footage of me going back into the downtown Brooklyn post office and putting these postal labels back into circulation. And so this for me, it did a couple things. Like one thing, it was a public space project where I was getting more and more involved in, but it was also a public space project that was connected to the internet, right? Because this is a piece that probably in real space, nobody even knew they were participating in this project, right? Probably most people were taking these labels and mailing them around the world or wherever they were going and had no idea that anything that was going on. But this video footage, I think this is probably the first time I'd ever had a piece like go around the web, go around the kind of viral circuit of the web. And that was really empowering to me because at the same time I was in class and I was presenting a lot of my graffiti analysis projects and having to deal with satisfying my immediate peers in the room and my professors. I was doing this other kind of work that was just, you know, had 3,000 views and was on Boing Boing and people were leaving an array of comments. You know, this kind of feedback I was getting was outside the classroom walls. And it felt really empowering that I could speak on this larger platform. And so that kind of stuck with me a bit. And it also led to me thinking about activism in a different way, right? And thinking about maybe my time, because I was going to a lot of protests at the time, and I was thinking like maybe my time could be better spent than just holding a sign, you know? And I was looking at people like the Yes Men and seeing a kind of activism that actually, I've heard called radical entertainment by this, even Franco Matez is another artist group I like. They call it radical entertainment, or this idea that you can bring people to these projects that may have potentially like unpopular ideas, but if you bring it to them in a way where they want to take part in it, where there's a laugh, they might come to it irregardless of the politics, and then you have, I think, an easier way to kind of insert your own ideas than if you're just kind of like banging a drum, you know? And so this was the kind of activism I felt like I was interested in, and it felt like the kind of activism that I could take part in and maybe help with more. And so that was kind of in my mind as I was swirling around looking for new projects to do after I graduated. I was also kind of coming to the realization that I wasn't really in love with graffiti. Like I was more interested in graffiti because graffiti is a really good community of hackers. Like here's a community of people that are taking existing systems and using them for totally new purposes, right? And this is something I think it's really easy to forget because graffiti's been around for so long and it's kind of come in and out of fashion and we take a lot of things for granted, but there's, like it was, when someone took a can of spray paint and bought it at the hardware store and then pointed it at somebody else's property and wrote their name, that was a really interesting misuse, right? That was an interesting misuse of a product that's changed the way every city in the world looks now. And even with the trains in New York, you know, this is a different kind of information era. And here there's a system that they figured out how to misuse to like transport art all around the city in a time when you couldn't post JPEGs on the internet. And this also was a really interesting hack. Like this was a really interesting group of hackers. And so the kind of graffiti that I loved is the graffiti, like, isn't necessarily the graffiti that, like, what I love about this is the fact that it's abusing the system, right? And it's not the colors and it's not the can control, it's not painting that I'm interested in. It's like where you place those letters. What system are you hacking into? How are you completely changing the meaning of this structure with a very small, clever, playful intervention? And so this is a piece by William Lamson. This is probably my favorite graffiti project of all time. And the kind of hashtags at the bottom here actually come from hacking culture. Like these are words that describe how hackers approach problems, but when you look at those words and you look at what graffiti writers and street artists have been doing, like you can see that these are two groups of people who are thinking about problem solving in a really similar and a really interesting way, at least I think. So this idea of kind of unintended use is something that I kind of started looking at as, it's a way you could look at everything. It's just a lens you can look at the world on, is this idea of misusing the things around you. So like, you know, robotic vacuum cleaners, when you duct tape knives to, become much, much more interesting projects than their original intended purpose, you know? This is not one of my pieces. This is an internet meme called Doomba. It's incredible, right? And so those kind of ideas were swirling around my head, and I got an art fellowship at a place called I-Beam in New York, an art nonprofit that kind of specializes in art and technology. And I met some interesting people there. One of them was this kind of ex-robotics guy named James Powderly, and we started talking, and we said, why don't we take some of these ideas and we'll get these two communities talking more, these computer hackers and graffiti writers, get them in the same room. We always kind of thought of ourselves as Q in James Bond, like we weren't gonna be the one wielding the gun, we weren't gonna be the one writing the tags, we were gonna be trying to supply this community of like graffiti writers and activists with new tools, right? We were gonna be their kind of like arms dealer. And so the first project we made, which kind of launched the group, was this project called LED Throwies, which is the simplest electronics project you can ever do. It's essentially just a magnet and a battery and an LED taped together and then done in mass and thrown at things. It's like a pretty base, simple project. But when you get a community of people together to do this, it can turn into these sort of interesting actions. This was in Linz. They still had metal in their trains. Like when we did this in New York and we threw in at the train, we were like, this is gonna be a great project, and the trains are all made of aluminum now, so of course it just bounced off. But in Austria, they still have steel in them, so we could, it would work. So this was a moment where and people really got, all we had to do was show up with this box and hand them out, and all of a sudden people were engaging in this public space project, perhaps for the first time. And we were releasing everything open source. This was much about spreading open source culture as it was about public space and getting people involved outside. So we would make videos like this and seed them on the internet and try to have them get picked up in YouTube. This is kind of in a pre-social web. But then we would always pair it with source code or how-to guides. We would always have this invitation for other people to come into the project. Like this wasn't our technology. This was something we were trying to make for everyone, right? And so we saw people using it. LED Throwies was crazy. Like the amount of people that used LED Throwies went way beyond our expectations. And in a sense, it was an inspiring first project for us to have because we saw how this could turn into everything from like marriage proposals to like pretty aggressive, like this is Students for Free Tibet in Beijing during the Olympics, right? So like that whole breadth of like, we saw like kids doing their first electronics project, and then we also saw it used for activist projects that we were happy that we could kind of help support in this kind of open model. And one thing we learned from that whole thing is that the bigger hack here was not the technological hack, but it was the social hack, right? So for example, like this photo showed up heavily in the New York Times and then bounced around the internet. And I'm pretty sure had they made this a standard activist banner drop, which we've all seen 100 times, this image would have not circulated around the web quite as heavily as it did because we were playing into like this story that the media was wanting to write, which was technology is here, we're living in the future, you know, graffiti writers have lasers and cars are flying, you know, this was like the narrative that they want to write about. And so we started seeing that the media was reporting on projects that were using these technology that we were developing in disproportionate ways than they would have had they not used them. And so this was like a much more interesting hack to us than the technological hack. We like figured out this kind of like hack within the media that we could spread these ideas with. Another project we released under Graffiti Research Lab is this project called Laser Tag. Laser Tag is essentially a digital projector and motion tracking software combined with a laser, and it set up a system in a way similar to Graffiti Analysis where the technology totally disappears, and we could go to these locations and just without permission set up our stuff. We would invite activists, we'd invite graffiti writers, and we would just hand them a laser, and within a second the interface is immediately apparent. We would set some architectural element of the building to be an erase, so they would basically just write and then they'd zap the erase button and they'd keep going. And it became, again, it like had this interesting thing where in public space people would gather. We thought of it as this kind of like free speech amplification tool to kind of, a lot of the tools that we were making were meant to sort of be in this a kind of voice that was meant to level the playing field between the voice that advertising had in a city and people who live in the city have, right? Like we rarely get to speak in LEDs, we rarely get to speak in the scale of billboards, and so we were trying to make tools that were helping like bring that, what was a disproportionate communication in the city, like at least up a little bit, you know? We'll never beat the advertisers, they've got too much money. So this is like an example of a software project that we were doing. This was also released open source. People to this day are still using the software. I was actually just telling someone before this that we embedded a piece within the software where it sends the group of us an email every time someone launches it, and it tells us what the name of their network is. And if we think it's a network that sounds like an advertising agency, we can flip a 1 from 0, and every time they launch it, instead of running the laser tag application, it just plays that stupid Rick Astley video over and over again. So yeah, there's good days where like we'll do that and then we'll see like 20 different emails like come in where they're just sitting there relaunching and they're frustrated as hell. So Graffiti Research Lab, we kind of we opened up the project. We allowed anybody to start their own Graffiti Research Lab. There's a pretty thriving group in France of which I'm not running at all. I'm kind of a passive member, and I'm sort of happy to see that project off and running on its own. We sort of changed the focus at one point into this group called the Free Art and Technology Lab. Because we sort of were learning these things about how to spread this culture of open source through popular media, and we didn't feel like it had to be always tied to public space projects, and so we wanted to kind of open that up to a bigger group of people. Oh my God, it's 7:40. Okay, I'll show one quick. So Fat Lab, it's okay, I can skip all that, don't worry, it's not a big deal. Fat Lab, it was also kind of an experiment where we could open up the group to more people, and some of the things we learned from Graffiti Research Lab, we changed in the structure of Fat Lab. And so part of that was like, we didn't want to have any structure. We didn't want to have any rules. There was no formal structure for how to get in. It was all just like we gave away all the passwords to a bunch of friends and kind of let this like respectful anarchy kind of weave its magic. And so we didn't even have like a mission statement, but this kind of summed up what we were trying to do. I think this was something we could all kind of agree on, which is that what we were trying to make had some kind of nugget of content related to the free culture movement or related to free speech, but we were wrapping that in this kind of candy coating to try to have it spread around the internet in ways that were more entertaining, more in this idea of radical entertainment. So I'll show one clip that's a collaborative Fat Lab project. This was from a series of projects we called Fuck Google. And the kind of hack in this one, the point of entry, the point of weakness was that it's very easy to like rebrand these companies, right? Like you'll see from the TED installation inside, like it's very easy to, for example, rent a car and put a fake camera on top and a Google logo, and for the cost of a rental car and a roof rack, you essentially really look like the Google car, very convincing replica. And again, like everything on top of the roof of this car is just duct tape and paper. Like there's no technology up there. This is completely a social hack, a non-technical hack. And if you want to talk about misuse leading to empowerment, this is the most empowering experience I've ever had. When you drive around in one of these, this is like the Google Street View car, you are immune, you are untouchable, you can do anything. Like here, we were just, this is in Berlin, so we just saw what would happen if we just parked in the middle of the like busiest traffic circle, like, because Google is like untouchable, and so you can drink and drive. Here we pretended to carjack the car, and this guy who you'll see in a minute comes off the street like a concerned citizen who risks his life to jump in and save Google, This is how much we adore our captors. Give me my street view. And so we would do these projects, this is kind of a good example of the work we're trying to make. And so again, like our primary audience was the internet. Like we were doing this work in public space, but then trying to like get a conversation started besides the conversation, which is Google's conversation, which is we are not evil. I mean, and we did this before we learned that, of course, Google and Skype and several other mostly American companies have been spying on us and snitching on us to the government, right? Like this was even before all that. This was Yeah, they're clearly evil now. Like, we don't even need to make these projects anymore, right? So the TED piece that's in the gallery now is, I think, it's a project I did kind of with the Fat Lab also. It's a solo project that I showed with a group Fat show that's actually touring at the moment also. It's going to be in San Francisco in a month. But it's similar in the sense that it's kind of appropriating their brand, which is hard for them to defend when their brand is essentially like Helvetica bold and red. It's like the easiest logo to duplicate, you know? And so this is an installation in the show now, so you can come in and step onto the red carpet, and you can kind of convincingly fool the internet into thinking that perhaps you'd given a TED Talk. Like, we've given so much cultural emphasis to this kind of like sculpture here that when you share the stage, you imbue like all the power that's gone into this, you know? Like when Bill Gates rubbed off on it, his aura is now into the words that you said, so when you speak in front of this sign, like, people tend to listen. And so a lot of people use this to kind of pose for photos. At the first time we showed this in New York, one guy came up to me and said he was going to use it in his application for tenure at university. So that was like I don't know how I feel about that one necessarily, but so it's there, you can take photos. There's a place to set up a laptop, so I would encourage you, if you really want to play the whole game, you can create your own talk, set your laptop up there. There's a USB stick that has a lot of B-roll of like the TED intro sequence, and you can cut to like standing ovations at the end of your talk, how every TED Talk ends. And you can put it back on the internet, and depending on how skilled your editing procedures are, you can kind of convince the internet, at least for a moment, that perhaps you gave a TED Talk. And you can definitely convince Google. So this is a Google image search for TED Talk, and on the first page, you've got people using my installation that are actually ahead of Bill Gates. Who's over here. And so this is like, for me, kind of an example of how the gallery can almost be used as this entry point to the internet. Like, the two are having this dialogue where it's not just about this installation in the gallery. This is really a kind of backdoor entry into sort of, yeah, getting your results mixed in here with the cultural elite of, the TED. And so this again is like thinking about audience. Like, I was talking about this with some of the students that I met with yesterday, and thinking about how there's different audiences in our work today for sure. And one of them is the Bored at Work network. This is a term coined by Jonah Peretti, who's behind BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post, who's kind of a viral media genius. And this is like a really interesting audience to make art for, at least I think so. And so when I'm making work, I'm trying to think about how they're very different audiences, their attention spans are different, the time they can invest in the work is different. Although, you were telling me the other day, like the amount of time people spend in a gallery looking at work is 30 seconds. Did you tell me this? So maybe it's not as different as I think, actually. Maybe 30 seconds, whether you're wasting company time or in the gallery, is maybe what artwork gets these days. But either way, I think it's a legitimate audience to think about, and I think more than ever the gallery can be this entry point into the internet as well for work, and that work can have these kind of dual lives. And so now I like to think that the gallery is like a more contemplative space, and that if you come see the work in person and you sit with it, you can kind of tease out things that you might not if you were just watching the YouTube video. But it kind of gives me hope that there is this overlap between the art world and the real world, right? Like, I think that the internet provides that for us, and I think that the two overlap relatively smallly, but I think it exists. Like, I think the arts and the real world do overlap, and there is a place to make work where we're engaging with people outside of just the gallery system. And so maybe, let's see, okay, it's okay if I go to 8 maybe? I was going to talk about some of the work in the show. This is from a series called Multitouch, which is made very simply. I got asked about how this one's made, and it's really just, I put tracing paper over my phone, and I put ink on my fingers, and I perform these kind of routine gestures that were, designed by interface designers, and that we're all doing now, right? And so again, this plays very well as a sort of selfie on Tumblr, but that I hope also when you kind of stand there and think about the weight of this thing and the other issues that kind of get brought into it related to identity or even human evolution, right? Like this idea that we never did this before as humans. Like, there was no reason to do this like 20 times a day until now, and now we all do this 20 times a day. This one's called username and password. This one's called zoom in, zoom out. It's a diptych. And so these are sort of more like individualized versions. And again, it relates to sort of archiving and some of the ideas that I was thinking about archiving these fleeting gestures with the graffiti analysis work. I think this is sort of connected, but in a different way. It also kind of happens in a different way when you do it in mass, like thinking again about Edward Tufte's small multiple ideas. This is me playing Angry Birds, which is the large piece that you might see called Level Cleared on the wall in the gallery. And so this is another one where I think it can have, like my hope in this piece is that it has a double life, right? And that when you're seeing it online or when you're seeing it in person, like there might be this initial kind of laugh. Like I like it when the initial is a laugh and there's this connection to this thing that you have a connection to. Maybe you've played Angry Birds and maybe that's, you know, an interesting kind of pop cultural moment. But then I actually love that you guys installed the bench here. That wasn't my idea, but I think it's beautiful because I think when you actually sit with this piece, my hope is that it changes from being this kind of funny connection to this cartoon video game and ends up being more about this kind of visualization of time and time that's been, if not wasted, given away to something else, right? And so I like to think of this piece as like on a longer viewing, like a really dark piece. Like my ideal version of this piece is like people laugh for a second and then kind of like shake their head and wonder. And then this is me too, this isn't everybody, this is me dealing with the fact that I had an Angry Birds addiction. After this I went into Candy Crush. Now I'm like one of the best like video game, like Skate 2. Does anybody play Skate 2? I kill that game, man. So it's me wrestling with these things too. They're like, I've beaten Angry Birds 3 times now and I've lived in France for 5 years and don't speak French, right? This is another piece in the show. This is called Internet Cache Self-Portrait. So this is, as you may or may not be aware, when you surf online, everything you view is that in the browser is actually downloaded temporarily to your computer. And so the misuse in this is that I sort of, in the preferences setting for the browser, I increased the amount that it saves before it overwrites. Like the cache directory in our computers is this really unique place on computers where it erases data without telling you, right? Like as we browse the web, you don't want it to fill up to infinity, so it makes more room. And so I essentially started archiving that. Again, this is also sort of connected to like archiving these sort of fleeting moments that go by. And I've been doing this for like 3 or 4 years now and I have this huge set of primarily my own data. I've been doing this with other people now, but it's a really intimate thing to ask someone to give you your cache data. Because it's kind of like putting a security camera on your room as you're browsing, you know? And so it's everything that comes through the browser. It's not just the things that you are actively seeking out. It's like Google Maps and here's me like editing my web page. There's, these are sort of groupings of icons that you don't actually see this way. They're hidden behind. It's kind of the underpinnings of how web design works. And so you're getting a glimpse into that as well. And they turn into these prints in different formats. This is the one that's in the show now. And I'm thinking of them as portraits, but they're sort of intentionally meant to be false portraits. Like this idea that this isn't necessarily me. Like people, I get asked who these people are at the top. I don't even know who they are. I just happened to be browsing the web one day and that image popped into my browser and now there it is front and center forever in this piece. And I kind of like that in a sense because these portraits now exist, not just in print here for me, but for all of us. You have portraits too, and they exist on Google's server, and they exist on the NSA server. And so they have portraits of all of us too. And whether or not that represents who we actually are, I think is a good question. And when I put these up, I don't even look at them before I print them because it's embarrassing for me to flip through there and look through what I was doing. I don't necessarily think that my browsing patterns define who I am necessarily, as I think that they don't probably define all of us. And so that's sort of meant to be built into the piece as well, is that this isn't, here's what my portrait looks like, but in reality, we all have these portraits and they're out there and people are using them and marketing to us and yeah. Good times on the internet these days. I'm gonna skip forward a little bit. I wanted to show some of the newer work. Maybe I'll end with this piece, which is like the last one that I did before I started going into the newer strain. This is a piece called Free Speech, which isn't in the show, but I think it's connected to the work in the show. And this, like a lot of the other hacks that you hopefully see that I'm interested in now, are very simple, very non-technical. Like as I've gone further and further away from grad school, you can see I'm writing less and less code. Like I don't write code for fun. I'm like, in fact, it's the opposite. Like I try to not write code as much as I can. I'm more interested in these really, really simple systems. And so this system it's just a van with vinyl letters of a local phone number in Vienna, a loudspeaker on the top, and just this simple, instruction of this arrow and the word free. And when people would dial the number, there's nothing on the other end. Like there's no voice. It routes their call immediately into that loudspeaker. And so I'll play 1 minute of the video. What you'll see is people, like when they say hello, come to this realization that they have a louder voice than they kind of meant to have when they dialed that number. So this one's called Free Speech. And I like to end with like this clip in terms of talking about this like connection between misuse and empowerment, because like that's the face of empowerment. You know what I mean? Like that kind of like giddy happiness is what it feels like to be confronted with this like power that you weren't expecting. And I think that's like a powerful place to hit people with. And so like in this piece, we did this for 2 days and just drove around Vienna, and people said a lot of different things, and some of them were more profound than others. We had people reading poetry, but like some of my favorite ones were just those kind of like more visceral reactions of like people just experiencing, at least for a moment, what it feels like to have that like moment of empowerment. And so that's what kind of drives a lot of my work. And that's normally where I kind of end this portion of the presentation. And that sort of ends the work that I led up to the work that's in the show now. And with just, if I have like maybe 10 more minutes is okay, I'll show some of the work that I'm just opened up with this show in London. And I wanted to show it because it's a bit of a departure. It might be like, it's actually, I think, maybe less engaging in this format. I think it's better in a slower context to consume. But it's connected in the sense that like my original empowerment experiences was the internet. Like I remember being in architecture school and I had one class where they were teaching us HTML and 3D rendering. And I remember them showing me like a fetch window, like an FTP window, where the professor dragged in an index.html file to this window that didn't go to my computer but went to a server, right? And watching him let go of that and then hit refresh in the browser and understanding that I could update that web page. Like it sounds like nothing now, you know? But at the moment, this was like, I couldn't believe it. Like I was like, they haven't regulated this yet? You mean I can say anything for free to everybody? Like it's something we take for granted for the web now. But that for me was huge, and that kind of, I think over the course of 3 years led to me sort of switching career paths. It was really like that moment of empowerment that made me kind of want to go into the arts. And I think what's happened since then, and since I made a lot of the work in the show, is that there's been a big rift in the internet. Like personally, I feel like there was this big moment of empowerment with the internet, and then slowly over time, sort of the internet has really changed as it's become more and more centralized. Like everything that's happening now is like, we all thought it was going to distribute out, and we'd have all these different voices and all this different media, but what's happening is it's all centralizing, right? It's all going onto Facebook server for social media, it's all going onto Amazon server for storage and for real world purchases, and it's all going onto Google searchers for search. Like it's like the Big Bang that like then implodes, right? And so all that's happening, centralization is happening, monetization is happening, and then as we kind of went through, all understanding that everything we're doing all the time is being spied on by the NSA. Like I can't even say it enough. It's just like, for me, that was this other huge moment where everything kind of changed, and all of a sudden, like all those like lolcats on the internet didn't seem funny anymore, you know? Like, I don't even see the cats of the internet anymore. I just see Google dropping cookies in my browser and then snitching on me to the government, you know? And it was a big rift for me because the internet was this big inspiration. Like a lot of time when I'm making work, I'm trying to channel I was like, oh yeah, how did I feel in that class? You know, how did I feel when I had that empowering experience? How can I get back to that place? And so the show that I did in London was kind of all about that. Like trying to figure out how to get back to this place of a relationship with the internet where I could start making work again, where I wasn't just crippled by what's happening right now, which I think is crippling. And so the show, it essentially has two research threads that kind of overlap in a way. And one of them is internet infrastructure. Like, I wanted to understand more of what the internet was as a way of coming to grips with like reconnecting with it. And so I did a lot of research into like where it comes ashore. Like, where do those cables come ashore? What does that look like? Where are those fiber optic cables that connect all of us? And then at the same time, I was also doing research into ghost hunting communities. And that might sound like a big leap, right? But, and I can say that I'm sort of like agnostic when it comes to ghost hunting. Like, I don't really believe in ghosts, but the relationship that those communities have to technology, I think, is really interesting, and I think acts as kind of a metaphor that we all have to technology, right? Ghost hunters talk a lot about matrixing, like the fact that, or this idea, it's kind of the same idea that when you look at clouds, your brain wants to form faces, right? This is like built into us, right? And so this is something that comes up in ghost hunting communities a lot. Is like, are they seeing it or do they want to see it? It's something that they talk about. But I think it's something that we do too. You know, when we click on Facebook and we hit refresh and we see how many friends we have, like, is that really what's happening, or is that just what we want to see when we look at it? And also ghost hunting communities, they talk about ghosts being disembodied human energy, right? And so they're making these devices. This is a ghost hunting device I bought off the internet from a company called Digital Dowsing, which is like an incredible name for a ghost hunting tech company. And so essentially they're looking for disembodied human energy, which is kind of what I'm looking for on the web too. I'm looking for evidence of people. Like, I don't care about the sort of tech startup scene anymore, and companies and selling and commercialization and all this. I'm like looking for this like connection to people again, and this connection to this past internet that I can't find. And so these two things started, like these two research threads started coming together, and I started thinking like, well, maybe I could use these ghost hunting tools to try to find that connection, to try to find that reconnection to the web. And so when ghost hunters do their missions, they don't just do them in their bedroom or at work, right? Part of it is this pilgrimage to these places where something happened, right? Whether that's like a graveyard or an abandoned asylum. It's like there's some act of pilgrimage to a place. And so my research led me to this. This is the westernmost tip of the UK. This is the Cornwall region. It's like as far west as you can go in the UK, which for telecommunications is a great place because it's the closest place to getting across the Atlantic. And so I was kind of making this map. This is my research leading up to this isn't an art piece. This is like the map I was making for myself to go on this pilgrimage. And I was looking for all the little blue flags are internet fiber optic cables that are coming ashore from the US. The computer terminals are like places I might have access to collect data, like places that have open public terminals like libraries, tourist bureaus, hotel lobbies. And then the skull and crossbones are like potential places of hauntings like graveyards. And so I went on this trip, this pilgrimage, and it was just me alone, kind of like looking to reconnect to this internet. And so I was on the beaches and I was taking out my ghost hunting equipment and I was trying to find the internet. And so part of that was through photography. One of the only physical markers where you can actually see the internet are these little they're just a wooden yellow sign with a diamond and it says telephone cable on it. And it's like the most beautiful understatement, you know? Like this massive telecommunications comes across and all these like terabytes of data that are happening every second, and it's just like, bing, telephone cable. And I kind of love that. I love that there's these kind of like understatements that are so understated that they become beautiful. And so part of the project was taking these photos. And then lo and behold, I found the reason that I went on the trip in the first place. This didn't come up in my research before the trip. I stumbled across this and I went up there and I took photos and I did my ghost hunting readings. The pieces ended up as kind of these pairings of photos mixed with these etchings of the ghost hunting readouts. But this is from a location in Bude in Cornwall, which turns out to be the location where the NSA and the GCHQ in the British Secret Service set up their own station where they have their own cable that goes out in the ocean and taps into the internet, and then they beam it from satellites to their own. They have this Earth station that talks to their own satellites, and this is the place where they spied on all of our data. Like, I ended up just running into this, like, not exactly by accident. It makes sense that they would be there. But then it was this interesting moment, too, where the internet, which is this thing that kind of stems from, in the beginning, it was like academics, and it was non-professionals. And if you look at the web kind of 1.0 before social media, that was this, like, kind of like, again, beautifully understated place. And the way it comes ashore into the nature was just gorgeous. And then the way it gets spied on was the exact opposite, like this huge scar upon the landscape. Like you see these satellites for miles and miles down the beach, and they're just in the middle of these like cornfields, or these cow pastures. And so there was this kind of interesting thing happening with the way the two things kind of manifest physically. I also bought 2 kilometers of fiber optic cable from China, which is the minimum amount of fiber optic cable you can order to get it shipped over. And I kept finding these photos on the internet of construction crews making these infinity symbols along the sides of highways. And I thought there was something really beautiful there. I was trying to figure out, like, what is that about? And it turns out this is like a best practiced way that they bury the fiber optic, which is you have to get the cable off the spool, which is not a big deal when you're pulling like, thread off of a spool. But when you have this massive cable, if you don't pull it off in the right way, you end up coiling it up and it turns into this gigantic spring, which becomes dangerous and damages the fiber and all these things. And so you have to pull it off and do these half turns every time, or else you end up with this nightmare. And so every time, this is called direct bury fiber optic. This is what is essentially underneath us at the moment, connecting us everywhere. And I love the idea that they go through this kind of ritual before it's buried every time. And so the piece I ended up making is called Burial Ceremony. And it's essentially me recreating what I found on YouTube, and I found PDFs that are like these best practice scenarios for how construction crews bury this cable. And I'm just recreating that and making essentially kind of these like monuments to the internet, this place that people come into the gallery and for a moment like commune with this physical piece of the internet infrastructure, which we never really get to see. And part of the inspiration for this came from this great book by Andrew Bloom called Tubes, and he has this quote where he says, the internet has no monuments, there's no place to go. Like the only thing I found on my trip was those signposts. And so part of this show is like trying to make those monuments as well. And the last thing I'll show from this exhibition, the last thing I'll show tonight, this is from another series in the same exhibition, and I wanted to show it also because I think it maybe connects to the work that's happening in the exhibition here. This is a series called Dances for Mobile Phones. And it was filmed with a camera that I bought from the Cleveland Paranormal Society, which is like so much fun to order, like from Paris also. And they get this box, and I was so excited. And ghost hunters will often shoot in what they call a full spectrum, which basically just means that in addition to the visual spectrum, they're shooting in small portions of ultraviolet and in small portions of infrared. And again, they're trying to capture this disembodied human energy, and with these devices, they think they have a better chance at that. And so I started filming, and I was interested, when people come to my studio for studio visits, or friends would come over to have a drink, anyone that would come into my studio, I would just invite them to sit down. I had this camera rig with this infrared camera, flooded with infrared light, and I would say, could we just like be quiet, and for however long you waste time on your phone, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, can you just sit down and do your thing? Like when you're sitting on the subway, whatever that is, kill some time on your phone. And the interesting thing that happens when you view pixels through infrared is that pixels don't emit any infrared, right? And so the user who's using the phone sees everything normally, but through this ghost hunting device, we just see this dead brick. And the audio is actually just the analog I have a microphone on the back, so this is the audio you're hearing is just analog as well. And so it sort of inverts the visual spectrum, so you don't see what you're supposed to see, but for anybody who has an iPhone, if you see the light that's happening at the top, this happens every time you hit that small button at the bottom. Every time you hit that button, there's an infrared light there, and as far as I can understand, that's Siri, like, spying on you. And so again, it's like trying to come up with, it's bringing back into this idea again of that we have these devices that are running software that we didn't ask for. And so the visual spectrum is kind of being inverted, and what we're left with is a glimpse of the people instead of the software, right? Like we're looking again at the movement, which is maybe a connection to the graffiti analysis. I think it's also a connection to the slide to unlock piece that's here. So it's foregrounding the person and distancing the technology. And so in the exhibition, they're kind of done in multiples, and so the audio kind of is a big piece. Starting to get this online, so there'll be more of these videos online soon. that's the last thing I wanted to show. I'll leave you with invitations. There's 2 invitations into the gallery. One is the TED sign, so that's there. Use it, abuse it, post it to the internet and send me links when it's there. The other is a smaller one, but it's where the title comes from. There's some stickers near the entrance, and these are just stickers you can put on the back of your driver's license if you feel like donating your intellectual property into the public commons upon the unfortunate demise. And I can be contacted here. The Google search still works. If you do the badass motherfucker, you can find me there. My email is here. I really wanted to thank everyone that brought me over here because it's not all the time that I get to come and talk to everybody and meet everybody who's going to see the show. And so that was like a big ask. So thanks for bringing me over here. I had so many great conversations since I was here. I really enjoyed speaking with the students. So James, Jana, Bob, everyone that brought me over here for that. Ginger and Judy from Curators Squared. And the graduate students I talked to yesterday, that was actually really great for me. I felt like I was really happy that actually happened first. Like I feel like more like I know who I'm talking to now. And I saw some great work yesterday that was really inspiring. So thank you so much, and let's go have some drinks, no?